Obviously, what has transpired yesterday um, leads us to know it's more of the finality to this conversation, this debate, and we can maybe dissect the principles of this debate from both sides, separate from the outcome and the consequences of this outcome and what it means. Because I do believe there's a difference there. Celine in the chat saying Mexico is offering help to Assange. Yes, I saw that. The AMLO administration are offering that. Good to see. Good to see. I did see like a BuzzFeed article though saying spinning it as how was the headline? It was Julian Assange allowed in the most dangerous country or city in the world. I think it was like a BuzzFeed headline today about Julian Assange. It was crazy, crazy. But digressing back to Nancy Pelosi, the whole force the vote issue. Again, I'm going to tackle the outcome of Nancy Pelosi being reelected and how the squad voted, my thoughts on that, what we should do as the left moving forward, and that's where it kind of connects to the principles of the force the vote debate before we got this congressional vote on Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House. But before I give my thoughts and my opinion about it, I think it's only fair that I present both sides as equally as I can about this subject. I do believe they're deserving of that. I respect enough people on both sides of this debate, even though I understand the criticisms of certain actors and certain people within both sides and both camps. I understand that completely. But Breonna Joy Gray, I overall pretty much respect and highly respect in some fashion. And Ben Burgess, I respect as well. I'm going to let them give and present both sides of the equation of the force the vote issue and then give my take on it. Excuse me. First, let's obviously give a shout out to Katie Halper show. You should all subscribe. Seriously. She does great work and constant content. Like, that's the best part. And there's a few people out there in the left that just get great guests, and she routinely gets amazing guests. So shout out to Katie Halper, always. Breonna Joy Gray, talking a few weeks, obviously, ago about this issue when it first started. And let's run the tape.
So can you tell people about the piece that you wrote, your latest piece, which has been getting so much buzz, as is your want?
Yeah, sure. I think I'll start with the piece that I think is really left out of the conversation, which is this. We have an enormous gulf between what American citizens want from their elected officials with respect to Medicare for all and what those elected officials are willing to offer up. As everyone here on this panel knows, even a Fox News poll said that 72% of Americans support Medicare for all. Almost, 50% approximately goes up and down a little of Republican support Medicare for all. We are in the middle of a global pandemic in which over 14 million people have just lost their health insurance. And we have to start to ask the question, why is it with all of this pressure, which should very naturally lead politicians to want to start running on Medicare for all, they're not doing so? And I think the obvious answer is that there is a multi-million billion-dollar industry geared toward making sure that we stay on a private healthcare system. So the media is obviously complicit in this. It could be that media figures held politicians accountable, that they drew the connection between how much money these individuals were taking from pharmaceutical and private insurance companies. Someone might have flagged the fact that Jim Clyburn takes more money from these industries than anybody else in Congress. And there might be a relationship between that and his support of Joe Biden and the rehabilitation of Joe Biden by the Democratic Party to knock Bernie Sanders out of the race in the 11th inning. But we know that hasn't happened and is unlikely to happen. So when Jamie Dore surfaced this idea,
I have got an actual plan to get us a vote on Medicare for all in the House of Representatives. What? All that is required to get a vote on Medicare for all in the House of Representatives is for 15 congressional progressives to use their power. Will they? Because America needs Medicare for all right now. Okay? We're in the middle of a pandemic. As people are losing their employment, they also lose their health care. This doesn't happen in any other first world industrial country on the planet. And just so you know, what is happening right now, the government denying you health care in the middle of a pandemic, this is not normal. No matter what they say, this is not acceptable or normal. Congress just gave trillions of dollars to the top billionaires, subsidizing Wall Street's frenzy of profiteering while millions of families are on the financial brink. Not only does America need Medicare for all, America wants Medicare for all. You think I'm kidding? There it is. The solution is one of the most popular policies in the nation. One of the most popular policies of the nation, which is supported by overwhelming majorities of Democratic Party voters and supported by the majority of Republican Party voters. Yet the Democratic Party majority Speaker of the House has never put Medicare for all on the floor for a vote. Who do they really work for? And now, Democrats have nominated Nancy Pelosi to be the Speaker of the House again without a challenge. To win the House speakership, Pelosi needs to secure the majority of the full House. The House votes the first week of January. This is our leverage. Now is our time. It's our time now. I call upon all elected House members, all the members who ran on Medicare for all, and for all the members who are part of the Progressive Caucus in Congress, all the members of the squad. What we need to do now is we need to work together as a movement. What do we need? We need 15 Democrats. That's all we need. 15 Democrats to tell Nancy Pelosi that you will not vote for her as Speaker unless Medicare for all is put on the House floor for a vote. That's it. It's really that simple. Now is the time for progressives to exercise their power, play hardball, and use their power for the benefit of their constituents. Pramila Jayapal's Medicare for All legislation, House Resolution 1384, I want you to tell Nancy Pelosi to put that legislation on the floor for a vote. Make Pelosi promise on video, in writing, or in public that she's going to do that. No vote for Nancy Pelosi unless Medicare for All is put on the House floor for a vote. There's nearly 100 members of the Progressive Caucus. There's 100 members. Look at this. We only need 15 members to pull this off. 15 members withholding their vote for Nancy Pelosi will show that progressives are willing to exert power to help the people.
So when Jamie Dore surfaced this idea, and it naturally caught fire in a really organic way, and galvanized people, made a lot of people on the left feel hopeful, and like there was a fight still to be had that could advance our interest. I thought it was a really good idea, largely because in the absence of any other strategy to force the media to pay attention to that enormous chasm between where Americans are and where their politicians are, I think this is an opportunity that's too good to exploit. And we're not going to have it again. This pandemic is obviously horrible. I think today is like the highest death toll that we've ever had. But if there could be any silver lining out of this, it should be that it has laid bare the vulnerabilities in our healthcare system. Our political leadership has admitted, it has acknowledged that healthcare should be free for COVID sufferers. And there is a real slippery slope between that and acknowledging that healthcare should be free at point of service for all. And you saw how vulnerable they are there when I simply quote tweeted Kamala Harris in the spring saying, free healthcare for COVID is a good start, but what if someone is dying of cancer or diabetes and the entire internet collapsed? They know there's a vulnerability there, and I think this is an amazing opportunity to exploit it, not just because of the pandemic, but also because Nancy Pelosi is someone who is one of the most unpopular politicians in America. Her popularity rating is worse than Trump. And the fact of Nancy Pelosi being the linchpin in all of this is guaranteed to draw a certain amount of media attention, if only from the right, who will relish the idea of her being bent over the proverbial barrel.
Fun.
Yeah. How did you kind of come to the position you came to?
Well, I am as aware as anyone of how Jimmy Dore is perceived. I've had my own little dust-ups with him in the past. But the thing is, I was listening to the counter arguments and none of them were substantive. I mean, it was all, I don't like Jimmy Dore, which is fine. There's plenty of reasons that people have to feel that way. But what I'm attuned to, what I used to pay attention to as, a comms person was, what the response was when you're selling certain kinds of things, when you're pitching certain kinds of things. And, I'm not saying I'm some expert. I'm not Bernie Sanders who's been going to rooms and talking to people for 40 years, but I did have experiences on my campaign of feeling what sunk and what landed in terms of a pitch. And when you see a natural groundswell of enthusiasm around an idea, I don't think that one's first instinct should be to poo-poo it or say, this isn't the idea I would have chosen, this isn't the best potential strategy. If there are other positive things to ask for, other useful things to ask for, I think we should make those demands as well. I think that David Sirota is right to have pointed to some of the more wonky things that, the Jimmy Dores and the Mees of the world aren't going to come up with. And those things can be used in tandem with the floor vote. But I think that there are particular aspects of the floor vote that you can call them performative, you could call it theater, but I call it effective in galvanizing the kind of grassroots movement that would be necessary to really press this issue home. So yes, as I say in my article, you also would need, and I would hope that the progressive members of Congress, if they were to pursue this option, would reach out and try to galvanize support among labor and other activist groups, including Black Lives Matter, who we all know managed to galvanize millions of people in the street this summer, and who have as part of their platform universal health care.
Now let's go to Ben Burgess over at Jacobin and his own show. But give them an argument. I think that's the name of his show. Again, I'm gonna get into both after Ben says the other side, because there's a lot of things within what Brianna said and what Jimmy Dore said that I want to address, and there's stuff within what Ben's about to say that I want to address as well. So I'll just say it for the end.
During the pandemic, we need Medicare for all more desperately than ever. It's criminal that the Democratic leadership continues to oppose it. Everyone on the left agrees with that. But to understand how the Democratic and Republican establishments can succeed in continuing to block such a basic reform, we need to avoid the dangers of voluntarism, the idea that we can achieve important political results by just wanting them badly enough. It's vitally important that we win this fight, but to do that, we need to start with a realistic understanding of why we're losing. Nancy Pelosi has been reelected as Speaker of the House. I'd say that it had all the suspense of a Soviet election, but honestly, there was probably more factional wrangling within the Brezhnev-era power structure than at the top levels of the contemporary Democratic Party. Anyone on the left should be able to agree that Nancy Pelosi continuing to exercise any sort of power is a bad thing. But comedian and YouTube host Jimmy Dore has suggested that all of this reflects particularly badly on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, that AOC should have taken the leadership vote as an opportunity to exercise some sort of leverage in a way that would advance the cause of Medicare for all. How's that work? Well, his argument is that she should have taken a tough negotiating position, demanding that Pelosi agree to schedule a vote on Medicare for all in the House of Representatives as a condition of supporting her re-election to the speakership. To hear some of Jimmy's most intense online supporters, you'd think that if AOC had done this, the result would be that Medicare for all would become law. You'd think that after years of being one of the highest profile champions of Medicare for All on the national stage, AOC was revealing herself as a hypocrite, a sellout, at just the moment when she had a chance to make it a reality. Now, to be fair to Jimmy Dore, I don't think even he thinks that things would have played out that way. He knows it wouldn't have had the votes to pass even the House, never mind a Senate that will most likely be controlled by the GOP. His idea is this. There are currently well over 100 congressional co-sponsors of the Medicare for All bill. At least some of these people probably aren't serious about it. They're co-sponsoring to shore up their progressive credentials, but push came to shove, they wouldn't actually vote for it. So he thinks that having a vote would be a useful test. We'd see who was really supporting giving health care to their desperate constituents and who would ultimately side with the insurance industry. Once the battle lines were drawn, we'd know who to target. His premise is almost certainly right in some cases. I'm sure there are at least some congressional Democrats who are ready to make the gesture of symbolically supporting an important reform, but would think twice about enraging the donor class. But his idea for finding out who these people are collapses the second we start to think about it. Let's assume for the sake of argument that AOC has enough leverage to force Pelosi to allow a vote on Medicare for All. She almost certainly does not have that kind of leverage, because why would she? It's not as if Pelosi was in a close leadership race where she desperately needed the votes of a few leftists. But whatever, let's pretend she did. When that vote happened, why would anyone who was co-sponsoring it vote against it? Assuming that these insincere co-sponsors can do basic arithmetic, they know it was perfectly safe to vote for it, because if literally every single co-sponsor voted for it, and they somehow conjured up another 100 votes out of thin air, it would still be defeated in the House. And that's not even mentioning the existence of the Senate, or a president-elect who openly said on the campaign trail that if it did somehow pass both houses, he'd veto it. So why the hell wouldn't anyone willing to symbolically co-sponsor Medicare for All, thinking it wouldn't go anywhere, also cast a symbolic vote for Medicare for All, again, knowing that it wouldn't go anywhere? This idea makes no sense. So why are so many people in Dora's audience so willing to believe it and to denounce one of the only real solid social democrats in the House over this? The underlying disease is voluntarism, the idea that we can will important political outcomes into existence. Put a different way, voluntarism is the idea that anything is possible, regardless of the political terrain we're fighting on. And if anything is always possible, then only personal motivations explain why things happen the way they happen. Voluntarists attribute failures and losses not to larger structural factors, but to the losers having not fought hard enough to win in the first place. Rather than assessing the circumstances in which actors must make tough choices, they're instead considered to be sellouts and hypocrites. Think about the kind of leftists, they exist, I've met some, who think that Evo Morales must be a sellout because the Bolivian capitalist class wasn't expropriated during his tenure as president. Never mind that cutting off one tiny developing nation from the world economy would have been a humanitarian disaster, very quickly followed by a political disaster. Now, of course, there are moments when a particular individual does have a unique amount of leverage over the course of history. If Vladimir Lenin didn't return to Petrograd in October 1917, one could reasonably argue that the Bolshevik Revolution wouldn't have happened, and the 20th century would have looked very different. Similarly, while the American president is surely constrained in many respects, he has a far greater ability to dramatically change the course of human existence through his political choices than nearly any other actor. But these examples aren't voluntarism precisely because, in both cases, the institutional and structural factors in their particular context enable greater individual impact. For a single modern congresswoman, that's just not the case. Voluntarism needs to be resisted, not primarily because it's unkind or uncharitable to the leaders castigated for allegedly not wanting good outcomes badly enough, but much more importantly because it blocks us from seeing things clearly, so we can start to think about what strategy could actually lead us to victory. Maybe AOC should have refused to vote for Pelosi rather than extracting whatever tiny concessions she may have been able to get from her thoroughly lousy bargaining position. Her refusing to vote for Pelosi wouldn't have achieved anything concretely, but at least it would have been mildly ideologically clarifying for anyone who happened to be paying attention. That's not nothing, but symbolic victories alone should not be even our acceptable minimum. And whatever you think about that issue, let's get the big picture clear. The reason Medicare for All isn't going to become a reality in the next session of Congress or the one after that is not that the very few leftists in that institution don't want it badly enough. It's that the current balance of forces is extraordinarily unfavorable to the left. The American business elites have enormous wealth and enormous power, and we lack both a vibrant, militant American labor movement and political institutions like a workers' party or trade union confederations to multiply the strength of average working people. You might think that that sounds like an absurdly massive mountain to climb, but it's literally the only way anyone around the world has ever won these things in the past. In other words, the only solution is to do the long, slow, frustrating work of building a movement that can completely change the composition of Congress and organize at the base of society to overcome inevitable ruling class resistance to important reforms. There is no one neat trick that substitutes for organizing the working class and achieving power. Voluntarism is dangerous for the same reason that it's dangerous to swim in a riptide and assume that you won't drown if you just paddle hard enough. We need to be real about what's actually stopping us from achieving our goals if the serious left is ever going to be anything but a pointless sideshow.
Now, there's a lot to this debate that I think is not really worthwhile of discussion. Like when it comes to like Jimmy Dore and his personality, I tend not to care. I don't like Jimmy Dore. I think he doesn't do enough research into many topics. But besides the point, it doesn't matter to me that like Jimmy's involved. Like I don't care. Like Nico House, I don't like. I think he's a grifter. But like that's beside the point in some fashion. Like I see a lot of, before I get into like the actual meat, the meat of the discussion and the debate between these two sides, I want to point out that there's been a lot of accusations on both sides about either being opportunist, reformist, whatever sort of adjective you want to use, and on the other side being reactionaries and being grifters, right? And there are 100% reactionaries on some sides, you have opportunists on some sides, you have reformists on some sides that are not truly anti-capital and anti-imperialist. Like, of course, we're going to have people involved on both spectrums of this leftist debate that are not serious, good faith actors in this discussion. We're involved with so many different media outlets and consultation firm, so to speak. You're going to get into people that do not have good intentions, of course. But that's besides the point in some fashion, because there are people on both sides that I do respect. And again, there's an element to this discussion that is completely separate from the Nancy Pelosi Medicare for All side to it. But first, let me address that point, the Nancy Pelosi vote and the Medicare for All floor vote that was to be forced or wanted to be forced. One, I don't think we could have ever got that forced floor vote. I think even in the best case scenario of like the 7 or 8 or 9 people, how many people we want to put into the squad, if they all said, no, we're not going to vote for Nancy Pelosi, they had enough votes in that category, so to speak, to stop her from getting a majority in Congress and stop her from being Speaker of the House. But it would have gone to a second round, and a third round, and a fourth round if need be. And I think any serious person in politics understands that Nancy Pelosi at some point would have got enough votes irregardless of the squad. So I feel like that needs to be stated, but let's table that because we're done with that point. Now, the idea of Medicare for all, can that actually be gained in the system? I think Ben Burgess described it perfectly on why it is unlikely that we are to get Medicare for all actually passed this way. It is purely symbolic, purely performative, and that might be fine sometimes. Like performative wins and symbolic wins for morale boosters. I understand that sentiment. When we talk about the actual sort of principles of the argument, we can get into that later. But the actual material reality of what happened and what is happening is that Medicare for all cannot be passed this way. So let's stop acting like that's even a potentiality here in this equation, in this scenario. It's not happening. Whether we want to debate about symbolic victories and whether in this scenario it's worth it, we can talk about that. We can discuss that. I think that is a better discussion. On top of it, as we know now, right, because both of these videos were done before we got the actual Speaker of the House vote, the entire squad, however many people we want to put into that group, it's run around, 10 people, give or take, they unanimously voted for Nancy Pelosi. And some of them, not all of them, but some of them did have campaign promises and stated on the record at certain times that they wouldn't vote for Nancy Pelosi. And the fact that they did is shameful. I think that deserves to be criticized. I think that the idea that they should be shielded from criticism for that for breaking campaign promises it just doesn't make sense to me. That's not how politics works. However, when it comes back to thinking that something's going to happen that isn't reality based, we knew heading into this that most of the squad, if not all of them, especially those that have already been in positions of power in Congress, not the ones that have just been elected, they've already cozied up to Nancy Pelosi and the establishment. Right? And this is where we get into the principles of the matter. At this level, if you are in Congress, at the very best, you are a reformist. At the very best, you're a social democrat. That means you're still pro-capitalism. You don't want to reform it, clean up the edges a little bit, right? But you're still pro-capitalism. You're not even necessarily anti-imperialist. So we have to be realistic about what the squad is, what power they really have, and what they want to achieve comparative to us, right? And how they want to achieve that. The strategy and tactics they go about that is different than communists, anarchists, from whatever. And I think that we can't get lost in that reality. That sometimes we do. Sometimes we put a lot of our hope in these few figures at the very top. And that is ahistorical. That is a almost naive approach to think about this political fight we're in. And that's where I kind of slip into more of the Ben Burgess, more of the anti-force the vote crowd, because I think they're absolutely right when it comes to this principle, that these type of symbolic battles are not really worth our time and energy. Why? Because they don't achieve material gains for the working class in any fashion. The idea that they really, in this specific case, that they add primary fodder, the more I've thought about it over the weeks, the more I think that's not reality-based, because, let's be honest, most people want Medicare for all already. We know that. But the president of the country, or the president-elect of the country, like Ben Burgess said, is on record stating that he would veto Medicare for all if it somehow passed the House and the Senate. So it's not necessarily a wedge issue at this point, unfortunately. And the idea that would separate, the wheat from the chaff in primaries in, Congress and elections for 2022 is purely speculative, and I don't have much faith in that, to be honest. That is going to be some massive wedge issue that we can even get these people that are fake symbolically supportive of Medicare for All to actually be true to their donor class and their overall class. I don't really believe that that's possible, that would even achieve any real gains, to be quite honest. So we come back down to these different types of fighting, and the force the vote issue is a top-down way to fight for change, and I think that is getting way ahead of ourselves in terms of our power dynamic as the left. Okay? One, we don't really even have that many people in Congress that are leftists, air quotes, leftists, right? We don't have that many. It's maybe 10. It's maybe 12. It's not that many. You know, I can only think of, 2 people in the Senate that I would even consider to be leftists. And we have maybe 7 or 8, if, again, we're claiming social democracy and under the left, they amount to that. So we're talking about 10, 12 people. So the power dynamic is not there from the top to bottom structure to where we can actually affect change at the very top, to where it would, where we can change federal law and regulation and policy and institutions. We can't do that. We can't change the structural form at the very top. So how do we actually change that? We need a bottom-up structure of change. How do we do that? Is through labor militancy. Okay? How do we get the New Deal economics, the Keynesian setup that we had that lasted for roughly, 40 years until the 70s, that protected workers, that focused the entire economy on full employment instead of protecting banks and the financial institutions, right? So how did we get there? It wasn't a top-down reformist change. It wasn't FDR being the saint, the next Jesus Christ, and deciding, you know what, I'm going to just help everyone in the Great Depression out. No. Okay? We had the CIO aggressively, and other trade unions and confederations heavily push the government and the economy in their direction. How? Through massive strikes, shutting down the economy, blowing up factories, shit like that. Okay? The Socialist Party, the Communist Party, we had a thrivant leftist party, organizational structures on both sides of the paradigm in terms of socialists and communists, and they were militant. They were heavily involved in the labor movement. And there was this tandem, this combination, this intertwining of power and institutions between the leftist political organizations and the leftist labor organizations. Okay? And systematically, over the last 80 years, give or take, they have been systematically broken down and dismantled through neoliberal globalization, through many different steps on how the U.S. government dismantled unions, broke them apart, and ultimately destroyed leftist political organizations as well. So we have to understand where we're starting at, okay, and what we need to do to get to even a position to start changing the political and economic paradigm, okay? We want to talk about primarying out all these establishment Dems. We need a thriving militant left, both in labor and in political organizations. And they need to be working in tandem together. That's not happening right now. Okay? We need to rebuild our labor movement. That is the foundation of any successful leftist movement in the world in history. It is. There's no way we can circumvent that. I'm sorry. Okay? So, until we have that, these symbolic debates and battles seem like a waste of energy, to be honest. Both as for us, as we're debating each other and fighting tooth and nail against each other, just a waste of energy and time, and it's burning bridges when it shouldn't. And on top of it, it It isn't the battle we should be fighting. It isn't the battle or even the terrain that we should be on right now. Congress should be almost an afterthought in terms of what they do there. Okay? Because the very few leftists we have in Congress are so ineffective when it comes to their power dynamic that they can't do anything, even if they really tried. And if they tried, then I guess they'd be better leftists, but it wouldn't get us anywhere. That's the reality. We can shit on AOC and the squad all we want and say they're not true revolutionaries, because they're not, and we know that already. But the reality is that how we want change is not going to come from begging at a couple people in Congress for change. We need the capitalist class to fear us. They don't. Why? Because they have dismantled our strength, our foundation, our roots. So we need to rebuild those. Before we even talk about how we angle and measure policy to get passed in Congress. Even if we get to a point where we have a strong, thriving, militant labor movement again, do we even talk about electoralism as a primary strategy still? We shouldn't. It's not. It's not the primary strategy we should have. Anyways, that's overall my thoughts on the force to vote issue. I think that it's been a giant waste of energy and resources for the left. I think that overall, most people understand what we need to be doing, like what the foundational work needs to be done. And most of us are choosing not to for a variety of reasons. Maybe it's due to COVID and you're not wanting to go out and organize right now. Maybe it's due to whatever. Okay? I'll give people benefit of the doubt. But the reality is that we're not reviving our labor movement at this second. We're bickering online on Twitter about media personalities and which one's a grifter. Like, who fucking cares? Like, imagine talking to, like, a normie, right, about this. When they just want better wages, they want less bills, they want possibly, if they're really inclined to politics, they don't want their taxpayer dollars to go towards, like, wars overseas. They want them to go towards schools and hospitals and shit like that. Like, that's what we're talking about here. And how do you galvanize them? You have to start in the workplace. Start at the labor force. Once we have worker strength and power, then we can get real concessions. Then we can really quickly, efficiently primary out these establishment Democrats. But right now, that's not the setup. Right now, we're a few steps behind really being at this position to talk about forcing establishment Democratic hands. And let's be honest, are we really believing the establishment Democratic Party and the Republican Party wouldn't coalesce to beat down 7 lefties in Congress? Like, come on here. Let's not kid ourselves. Let's not kid ourselves at all.